And especially within the church, we need, as racial minorities, to have a place at the table and a time to speak, right? Which means that folks in the majority who have had more space and more opportunity for their views to be heard and known need to actually, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. But so that's when you're listening to minorities. Like, listen. And there's a lot to learn, because trust me, we've been thinking about this our whole lives. In one way or another, the world won't let us forget. But for white folks, here's the solidarity piece again. You can sort of choose when and when not to engage in issues of race. And so if you feel like getting into it one day, you can go to the meeting, you can read the book, you can do whatever. But if you wanted to, you can completely insulate yourself from any of that reality. And so part of what it means to show solidarity is to say, I'm going to keep that door open, I'm going to keep that light switch on, and I'm not going to disengage because my brothers and sisters who are minorities, they don't have the opportunity to disengage. So I'm going to stay in it with them because they can't escape it. I'm not leaving them behind either. So that's one part. But then the other part is this. When you're with your roommates or you're at Thanksgiving and Uncle Bob starts talking some racist stuff, that's when you can intercede, because we're never going to be at that table necessarily. So you need to be speaking to folks who are in your circle who we may not have access to, other white folks in particular, and letting them hear and see some of the things that you've heard and saw. So that when we encounter Uncle Bob, we're not the first ones to talk about equality and reconciliation, right? He's already heard it from his own family.
There's two questions that kind of are asking a similar thing, and so I think I just kind of want to meld them together, because we've talked a lot tonight about, black people in the church, white people in the church, and it can sound almost like there's two different churches. And so that's kind of the questions that are coming up, like black Christianity versus white Christianity. Are they same, different? How do we reconcile them? Do black people and white people worship the same God? Not in the sense that we're actually debating who God is, but by the time he gets down to us and through our perceptions and through our experiences, it seems like we're coming out with two different gospels almost, in the way that we perceive the way that it plays out in real life. And so it are these tensions between our interpretations and the way that our faith is filtered through our experiences. Can it be reconciled, and not just in the sense of spiritually, because I think that we all get that spiritually we're one, but can it be,
For real.
Yeah.
Let me preface this by saying, my focus is particularly African Americans and black-white relationships, but that is not to say that those are the only racial and ethnic dynamics that matter, right? There's all kinds of stuff with different ethnicities, and so what I always say is, hear the principle and apply that principle to your own context, right? And so you may be from the continent of Africa and a nation within that, and so the dynamics are going to be different. Where you come from, it may be more tribal, it may be more class, it may be more linguistic. All of these principles, though, are applicable across any types of differences. So I just want to acknowledge that there's certainly a broader spectrum than just black-white relations. However, because of the history of this country, namely race-based chattel slavery, which reduced human beings to the level of a commodity that you literally put a price on, where human beings were categorized in the same classification as sugar and rum and tobacco, there's a history there that we've got to deal with. And Christians have been complicit with that. We got to deal with it. That you had Christians using the Bible to justify dehumanization and slavery, saying that the curse of Ham, which was really a curse on Canaan, meant that people of African descent were always destined to serve Shem and Jacob. who were white, which is complete bunk. Terrible exegesis. You got folks using Acts 17:26, I believe, which talks about God establishing the bounds of their habitation, which is actually a verse on seeking out and reaching God, though he's actually not far from any one of us. It's a verse about evangelism and about the nations coming together under the banner of Christ. Folks use that same verse to say, well, since he determined the bounds of habitation, that means he wanted the races to be separate and justify segregation based on the Bible, which is complete bunk, terrible exegesis. We got to deal with that. And so, as it pertains to race and diversity, it can look very much like we worship in different gods. And I think the majority church needs to hear from racial and ethnic minorities about that and how to reconcile and remedy that. At the same time, the black church first of all, they didn't force themselves out. It's going to sound like a strong statement, but there's truth to it. Yep. There would be no black church without racism in the white church. Because look at the history of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Incredible story there. They were in a church in Philadelphia, Methodist church, predominantly white, but a very large African-American population. Swelled their numbers to the point they had to have a building campaign. They built a balcony, refurbished the sanctuary, and they were used to, when it reopened, the African-Americans were used to sitting in a particular spot. But now that the sanctuary had been changed around, the white leaders wanted them to sit elsewhere. So these men were praying. It was during a prayer. One of the deacons walks up and says, you got to get up, you got to go to this black section. And Absalom Jones says, okay, well, let's just wait till the prayer is over. He says, no, you got to go now. Calls over another deacon, drags him up on the floor. They go ahead and finish the prayer. As soon as the prayer is done, all of the black people walk out of the church, walk down the street, start another African, eventually what becomes the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That wasn't because of a theological difference, right? They were all Methodists. It wasn't because, and in many ways that's still the case, where we can share the same theology, but it's that cultural gap that keeps us apart.
When we do try to engage, there's a couple questions about what happens when we do try to engage that I think get at to like the emotional aspects of it. And one is what is unbiblical anger, because you made that distinction between biblical and unbiblical. You said it can be hard to tell the difference. So what is unbiblical anger? What is biblical anger? Because, and maybe if you could talk about some of the historical and biblical basis for that with the prophets or with, social justice advocates in the history of the church. But yeah, how do you make that distinction? Because there's anger, no doubt. So like how do you filter that through?
I mean, first of all, emotions aren't dirty. I think sometimes in the church we have a tendency to feel like if there's any quote-unquote negative emotion, we're doing something wrong, right? Anger is not unbiblical. If anger was so bad, explain to me flipping tables. So there is a righteous anger. What I find, I can really speak directly from my experience. When I have experienced times of unrighteous anger, it has to do a lot with pride. It has to do a lot with defending my own self, or even just my own perspective, where I'm going to be right. Whether I'm right or not, I'm going to be right. And I'm going to let you know it. And oftentimes our anger is a cover for the logical deficiencies in our argument. So that if we can't argue it and win on the merits of it alone, well, we're going to win it on our passion. Right? And so a lot of times it's a cover because we just don't want to be wrong. And so it's a prideful thing. Righteous anger, I have a sense that it has really nothing to do with me. What I'm doing is defending what my God says. And it's his message, and I'm his ambassador, so I'm just letting you know what the king said. Okay? And you can disagree with the message, but you're not disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with him. And at some point you're going to have to deal with that. But let it never be said, I didn't do my duty to let you know. So I think that's a rough difference. But again, grace and humility as racial minorities and as black folks in particular, we have every reason to be angry. It's been 400-something years, and we still arguing for our basic equality. We have every reason to be angry. And yet the Bible says, in your anger, do not sin. So we got to deal with the Lord on that. And I think that's where we get a Dr. Martin Luther King, who many criticized for being too accommodating to white racists. But I don't think under the Sermon on the Mount and turn the other cheek, and how many times must I forgive? 7 times? No, 70 times 7 times. I don't think you can get away with that.
On the other side of anger, we talked about brothers and sisters in the majority hearing people out about their experiences. And I think that there's a term that gets tossed around a lot, which is white guilt. And we talk a lot about how white guilt is not necessarily helpful. Sometimes it can become a greater burden because you feel like not only am I carrying my oppression, but I'm carrying your guilt and your tears about my oppression. You know what I mean? So like, I think that's
You mean white guilt or white fragility?
All of it. All of it. Somebody asked a real question that's like, I think is like really valid, and it's like, okay, well, how do you distinguish between white guilt, which can sometimes be unhelpful, and white conviction, which is what is of the Spirit when God is moving to kind of like actually do the work that we're saying needs to be done in our hearts about this issue? How do we distinguish that?
Well, I've never been white, so I'm not quite sure what white guilt is. However, I do understand feeling like you have to carry that burden, and because of really many white people for the first time confronting real issues of racism and how they may have unwittingly benefited from a system that was designed to marginalize some and center others. I think there's a sort of human reflex to push that away, and that's a burden. That's another burden minorities carry. I think white guilt can be harmful because it has to do with a sense of like obligation, where if I'm not saying certain things or checking certain boxes, then I'm not being a sensitive, racially sensitive white person, or others expect me to do this, therefore I must do it. It's very external, right? It's this pressure from outside, whereas godly grief kind of wells up within you from a sense of conviction from the Word and the movement of the Holy Spirit that says, not only I have to do this, but it's my joy to do it for the sake of my brothers and sisters. I will gladly, as Jesus did, lay down my life, lay down certain social privileges that I have for the sake of the flourishing of someone else. And so I think it's that internal-external dynamic. Now I say the term, white guilt, white fragility, those are very jarring terms. I don't think you have to use that nomenclature. There are a lot of ways to express the same idea, but the fragility piece is if you've never dealt with a very difficult truth, it's going to hurt, it's going to sting initially when you start dealing with it. But the only thing I can say is you got to push through that. And it will get better. You will develop more awareness, and if not for your own sake, then for the sake of other people who are still hurting and need you to be allies.
And I think that leads into one maybe last question, which is like, so whether it's from on the side of people who feel like they are needed to be allies, or people who feel like they need to stand up for their cause, where do people find the courage to, and the conviction that it's actually going to do something to, I guess, stand up in whatever their context is? Because one person talks about just feeling pessimistic, like nothing's going to change, so like why do I keep speaking up, why do I keep doing these things? Like, where do you find that?
That's good. You are called to be faithful, not successful. You are called to be faithful, not successful. What do I mean by that? I mean that in your labors for justice, you could be working for fruit that you never see, fruit that you never get to taste. I am a product of trained grandmothers and grandfathers who never saw a day of freedom in their life, but wanted one day for their descendants to be free, college educated, healthy. And had it not been for their prayers and their labors and their resistance and their struggle, we wouldn't be where we are. You and we, we're all in the same place. We are laboring and struggling for a day we may not get to see. But we know that we are pushing forward a little bit at a time. And if we each do our part, that ball's going to move. It has moved, and we can be thankful for that. And you're not called to see the fruition. You're not called to be successful in all that you do. What you're called to do is be faithful in what you've been given to do. So take care of your responsibilities. And that relieves you of the burden of seeing the results, right? And of things not working out. You know that at the end of the day, he can say, well done, good and faithful servant, because you've been faithful. At the same time, Joshua 1:9 says, be strong and very courageous, for the Lord your God is with you. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. So by yourself, you're weak. By yourself, you're afraid. But when you remember that God is with you, and not only with you, but in you through the Holy Spirit, and he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world, you have all strength and all boldness to go out and do what you've been called to do. But don't rely on yourself. Rely on him working through you. And remember, we're simply instruments. And that gives us boldness. Again, we're just the ambassadors. You know, you can shoot the messenger, but it's somebody else's message. So I can be bold about that message.
One last question. So you talked about knowing that God is with you in this and feeling like you're doing this as his messenger, but I don't know about other people, but for me personally, sometimes I can feel ostracized from God in my anger about injustice or in my passion for racial justice, because sometimes it feels like God is just like letting all this stuff happen, and like I know that he's gonna do something at the very end, but like in the meantime I'm like, my people are dying, like how many more are just supposed to be slaughtered while we like wait for this perfect plan of yours to unfold? And sometimes, even though on one hand we believe that these convictions come from God, sometimes, and this might be, I mean, I'm sure this is pride in me, but sometimes I feel like I'm more convicted than God is, because I'm down here upset, and God is, it can feel like he's just on his throne, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. And so I guess, how do you hold on to that? How does this push us closer to God? And like, how do we remain convicted about who he is and his role in this, and not be like separated from the church and our God in our passion for this cause? Like, how do we keep him in his rightful place? That'll be the last one.
That's good. Sometimes I think we are Old Testament anemic. That is to say, a lot of us learn the faith strictly through a New Testament lens, which is great. Jesus is in the New Testament. What could be better? But if you look at the epistles, particularly the writings of Paul, it's very propositional, right? Do this, do that, because of this, because of that. It's very logical, systematic. The Old Testament is much more narratively based. And when you read the Old Testament, you see all of the themes and all of the emotions of human life. If it feels like God is distant and far off and doesn't care about injustice, read Lamentations. Read Psalms. Read the prophets, major and minor. He's always talking about justice. He's always mad at the oppressor. And that's where we get our righteous anger, because we see that God is a God of justice. He's on the side of the poor, on the side of the marginalized. Woe to the princes, woe to the kings who accept a bribe. He is not for that. And he's not playing around with that. But what we've done is limit ourselves to the New Testament, which is only 26% of the Bible, and neglected the lessons from 3/4 of the Bible, right? And so we need to become full Testament Christians, right? Old and new. And I think we'll see some of that righteous anger and some of that outrage at injustice. It's all there. But God can sometimes feel like he's distant. Sometimes like we're waiting for heaven for all these things. For me, that gives me energy. because I know that the kingdom of heaven has broken in to the here and now, and I, as a believer, am the evidence of that. And so I struggle with all of his might to enact justice. And that gives me motivation and energy that my life matters, because I'm fighting for the things that Christ himself died for. So I try to remember we're part of a bigger mission, and guess what? We would never, on this side of Christ's return, see perfection. That waits for Jesus to come again. That's why we're ultimately a people of hope. If you've read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, brilliant, insightful social analysis, almost completely devoid of any sense of hope. He's an atheist, and so he puts his hope in human beings. And really, he's seen enough of the world not to put his hope in human beings, but he puts his hope in sort of the struggle for truth and enlightenment type of things. And I just came away from reading that very sad. Sad for anyone who doesn't have the hope of the gospel, to know that we actually already have won. The victory is ours. It just has to wait its full fulfillment, but it's coming. It's coming.
With that, can we give Jemar Tisby a round of applause? Really enjoyed your perspective. One question for people who want to raise their voice: can they write for Rain?
Oh, good. So most of the articles on RAND, which is basically a blog, come from guest contributors. So we want to hear your stories and your perspectives. Like we said, we try to address the concerns of African Americans biblically, but we have people from all different ethnicities writing for us, men and women, from pastors to lay persons in the church. All we're looking for really is some perspective from the margins or about the margins. So you can be in the majority culture writing about something that you've learned about minorities or about your own self in terms of race relations or church or whatever it is. So really anyone is welcome. Email submit@randnetwork.org, submit@raanetwork.org, and you can just give us a pitch, a paragraph or so saying what you might want to talk about, and we have editors that will get back to you, or you can give us a whole post and they'll work with you. But yes, please do. Your voices need to be heard. What I want a couple things. One, I want a paper trail of protest, right? So if we look back now particularly at the black church, we don't have like a systematic theology textbook. Our theology is in our songs, it's in our sermons, because we weren't allowed to have formal education, read and write. So there's very scant historical evidence of black thought before a certain period. I want to create a paper trail so that 50 years from now, people can look back and say, what was the church thinking at this time? And secondly, I want to be a platform for people. We always say with Rand, we're not the voice, we're the microphone. And so we don't speak for every Reformed African American, we don't speak for all black people, we don't speak for all minorities. What we want to do is provide a platform that elevates other people. So submit@randnetwork.org.
Awesome. And I want to thank you. And before I give the announcements, I just want to ask a special request. Would you pray for us? Yeah, I just really appreciate it.
Heavenly Father, your word says that every good and perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights. And so we recognize that this time is a good and perfect gift from you. Lord, if there's anything that I've said that was errant or unwise, I pray that you would help us forget that and hold on to that which is good, to hold on to the truth. And Lord, I pray for the people in this room as a generation of believers who are passionate about you, concerned about justice. Holy Spirit, would you empower them? Would you commission them? Would you make clear to each individual in this room what his or her mission in your kingdom is? Help them to live as heavenly minded people on earth and so represent you and be the aroma of Christ to all they encounter. God, I pray that you would use and channel their energy toward righteous purposes. I pray that they would stay rooted in your word, Lord, and rooted in Christian community, that they might find strength, because this is a marathon, not a sprint. Help them endure, help them persevere. Lord God, help them with their studies, and help them be great stewards of this gift of being at Princeton University. With all the reputation, all the burdens that come with it, help them use this education and this network, not for their own glory, not for their own uplift or advancement, but purely for yours. And we pray this and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, everybody, one more round of applause.